welcome to the first ever live version of Open Door Policy Podcast. Welcome to our guests and our those in our audience here.
Hello. There, my parents are in the back, too. So welcome to my parents, too.
Okay.
Okay.
The center's holding down the fort in the middle.
And our guest, Tim. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, we're happy to have you.
So Tim Glemkowski is the founder and president of LALTO Catholic Institute. He's also a co-founder of Revive, which is a new apostolate, a new work he's doing to help parishes. We'll get into that a little bit later. But Tim, I know you've listened to Open Door Policy before, and
ODP.
you know ODP, as those in the know call it. And you know we start with rapid-fire questions. So are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. First question. Well, they changed from season to season, so you're not prepared at all. What is your superpower?
My superpower would be rapid speed or like by location. So I could be, all over the place. It'd be great. Yeah.
What do you remember about church as a kid?
Oh, man. Honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
The funny smell. We went to kind of an older parish.
The priest didn't wear deodorant? Or,
Wait. We can't get into explaining this yet.
What was the last live performance you saw, Tim?
The last live performance?
Yeah, game or concert or play.
Yeah, it would have been a game. We took our kids to the the Denver, or like the Rockies game last.
Baseball,
Baseball,
right?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, thanks for clarifying.
Yes, the Rockies game.
That's sports, Danielle.
Thanks.
So, what scent elicits an immediate memory other than weird-smelling church?
What scent?
Scent, what smell elicits an immediate memory?
Oh, I think kind of similarly, maybe in a similar genre is. We were really close with both my sets of my grandparents, so their houses, there's something about that just like comes back to me and is super nostalgic. Yeah.
Would you rather have it 100 degrees and humid or negative 10 below?
Gosh, neither. Denver has a very.
That's not an option.
One or the other, friend.
I'd rather be hot than cold. I don't love winter. Yep.
Okay, what are you praying for these days?
I would. Oh my gosh, this has to be a rapid fire question.
Sorry.
Yeah, I would say detachment, just an ability to be kind of like swept along by the Lord and trust. That He's just kind of letting God lead and kind of the ability to take my hands off the rein a little bit.
And back to live performance. But what was the first one you saw?
The
first concert. Sorry.
The first concert. This is back in the late '90s. There were some of these like concerts where they would have like a bunch of different acts, like Bewitched and 98 Degrees, and like they would all come together from like the Disney Channel. And when I was like in like third grade, and my parents took us to like one of these concerts, me and like my older sister, and that's embarrassing, but that's the honest truth. Yeah,
who were
that's like who it was. It was it was like nine and like Bewitched and but there was like a bunch of them. There were like 10 different groups and I can't believe I admitted that on a camera.
It's okay. What was the most beautiful church you've ever visited?
I think St. Peter's in Rome.
Yeah.
If we're being just like objectively,
yeah.
You can't beat that.
And lastly, Tim, what class could you teach?
Oh my gosh. Anything in this area that we love to talk about, anything that would be like missiology or evangelization or catechesis or anything that would be about the practical, making disciples kind of, I'd love to teach. The other classes would be like, I would do something on like the Lord of the Rings and stuff, or on the history of the Chicago Bulls.
Wow. Well,
awesome.
Good work. You made it through all 10.
I made it through.
So we're gonna circle back and talk about just like a few of these.
What smell in the church? What's the weird church smell? I don't know what that means.
So I grew up going to a parish that was a little bit older, and it had kind of a little bit of that musty mothballs kind of thing. They eventually built a new church, and now it's big and beautiful and everything. But there's something about I can like just still remember walking in there and yeah.
And you've been to St. Peter's, Rome. Was that a one-time thing, or have you been multiple times?
Yeah, I've only been. So we did. So I'm a Steubenville graduate.
Okay.
So. they have that undergrad, that study abroad program in Austria. So you're based like outside of Vienna, and then the school, the whole class, there's about 150 students studying there, takes a trip to Rome and Assisi, and Assisi was amazing too. The Basilica of St. Francis there was like one of the most life-changing. But so we were there for like a few days, and I went to St. Peter's a couple times. They did like the Scavi tour underneath to see St. Peter's bones and everything.
Have you been to Rome?
I have, yeah. I don't know if I'd put St. Peter's as the most beautiful church I've been to, though.
Interesting.
There are, like, really beautiful churches. Here in Detroit, I think, are really beautiful. But I know Danielle's walked the Camino. Coming to Santiago de Compostela is pretty awesome.
Oh, cool.
At the end of the Camino in Spain. I don't know. Like, I can't think of an answer to that.
Okay,
Danielle, what's
you-
your most beautiful church?
Wait, I can't tell it because that's going to come out this season.
Okay, all right.
Spoiler. Okay, so, but I would say, okay, pretend you guys, for some reason, you were on a flight with a best friend and you were going, like, and you were supposed to fly straight to Detroit, but for some reason, and you were coming not from Italy, you were coming from Poland or something, and you landed in Rome, like, accidentally, and they were like, okay, you have this small amount of time to see St. Peter's. Where would you take someone in, like, what do they need to see in the Basilica? Because you couldn't take forever in the Basilica.
Father, I think you would, yeah.
So I haven't been there a lot. I've been there twice in St. Peter's, and I think seeing as you walk in to your right is the Pietà, and that's pretty awesome. I mean, that's just so beautiful to see Our Lady holding, her son who she's given to the world. She's also received off of the cross, her faith, her trust, and like Jesus being completely in her hands. I think about that when I make the Marian consecration every year.
Yeah.
And I just think about how like Mary is always giving us to Jesus. So if we just had a little bit of time, I would just bring him to the Pietà and just say, just hang out here and look at this beautiful statue. Mm-hmm. What would you say, Tim?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I think, that was one of those moments where there were like certain things where, like, that was one of those where I'm standing in front of it and all of a sudden I'm thinking, like, that's actually the Pietà.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Michelangelo, right?
Yep.
Like, it was like one of those, you just couldn't even believe that you were there kind of looking at it moments. And it's so beautiful. It's so amazing. Like, it's one of those things, like, I've noticed the same thing. We do a lot of hiking in Denver, and we'll always text, like, pictures to, like, my mom and dad to be like, we did a great hike today. Look at this beautiful view. And you take the picture, and then you see it.
Right.
And it's like, never as
big.
good.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay. Like, you can still see that there's mountains there, but you can't see it in person. And I always felt the same thing with the Pietà. Like, seeing it in person was like, you've seen pictures, it's amazing, but seeing it there was like, whoa. It was kind of
This is church
here.
history and real. Yeah. That's really cool.
I just want to ask anyone in our audience, have any of you seen 98 Degrees in concert before? So we got, I think, Christina in back.
Yeah.
All right. So
All right.
2 people here have seen 98 Degrees in concert.
Where my millennials at? Yeah.
Tim and Christina. Okay, great.
Cool. Thanks so much. Well,
let's talk about your testimony, Tim.
Yeah.
Because like you're a guy who's worked for the church in a number of different capacities. Like, what first kind of helped you fall in love with the Lord and give your life to Him and want to not just make it a career and part of what you do, but really make it your vocation and mission to bring people to Christ?
Thanks. Yeah, that in a lot of ways is the question, right? That like it all flows from that initial encounter, everything that we do. And so for me, I grew up in a pretty good, I'm from Chicago, grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and grew up in a pretty good Catholic family. So I would say I was like a pretty well-formed kid. I knew a lot of the catechetical answers, and we were like a daily rosary kind of family, And my parents actually had like their own personal conversion when I was about 8 or 9 years old through a program called Curcio.
Oh, yeah.
Was real big for them. If anyone, So they had this huge, and I remember they came back from this retreat, and I was like, "What happened to mom and dad?"
Wow.
And I remember,
like good, what happened to mom and dad, or like
a little bit of both. If we're being honest, we had to start going to church a lot more, like every Sunday.
more musty smells?
Yeah, exactly. So in a lot of ways, like the deepening of their conversion led to us being a more Catholic family in terms of Catholic identity. And for me, I joke sometimes that maybe it happening when I was like 8 or 9, it was like just too late for me for it to really take or something like that. So I felt like I understood Catholicism from the inside to a degree, but at the same time, my heart had just never been really arrested for Christ. And so for me, it was an experience at a Steubenville conference, which is why I chose to go to school there eventually. Just the first night of the conference heard like a really beautiful proclamation of the gospel, and it just kind of ripped me open. And the whole next day, I remember at the conference, I just partied a lot in high school and played football and whatever,
So you were a high schooler here. at the time. This was a Steubenville High School.
That's right, at a high school conference.
Got
These youth conferences that they have, exactly. So, and my parents forced me to go.
Yeah.
You know, my mom shoves me on the bus, and I'm like dreading it the whole way there. And
shout out to all the parents forcing their kids
I have
to
a
do
friend
faith-based
not a bad thing.
who has a vocation, and his mom paid him $100 to go on a retreat.
it's like,
So yeah, we
to
all
me,
been
it was
there.
just, I mean, I hated it at the
Yeah.
time, but it probably was very good parenting. So, and it was finally, you know, I went to confession that day, and I thought my sins are just going to blow this priest away, right? He'd never met anyone as bad and edgy as me. And, you know, I absolve you from your sins. And I remember I went and prayed for a while and was like, what if this is real? You know, like just the thought occurred to me almost in a moment of like, I've learned about this like growing up, and I guess I never really stopped to ask that question almost.
Sure.
Like, but what if it's true? What does that mean for my life? And so that night in adoration, I kind of opened my heart to the Lord and just said, like, if you're real, I'm open, you know, and made this kind of thing. And, you know, it's probably somewhat ineffable from there, hard to describe, but really for the first time encountering a God who was real and who was active and alive in me. And it just shattered me. Just absolutely shattered me. So that was probably like the seminal moment that I always go back to. It's actually funny. This is kind of a weird thing, but I went back after that conference and like totally fell back into my old way of life for like a whole year. And then, so it's almost like it's funny because sometimes we wonder, you know, we do these experiences and does it really change anybody? I definitely fell back, but something had changed in me. There was a restlessness in me that eventually led to then I had just one Tuesday morning, I woke up and my parish had daily confessions, which I knew about. And I remember just waking up and it was after a party. And so I was a little bit, you know, kind of bleary eyed. And I remember looking in the mirror and being like that's it. I can't live this way anymore. I'm so empty. God has shown me so much more than this. And I just went to confession, and the rest is kind of history. So, for me, that's kind of what it all goes back to is that last year of high school.
Wow. And here you are today, and so you grew up in Chicago, but now you're in Denver. What are you doing there? Because you started a ministry.
Yeah, an apostolate.
An apostolate. One could say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is the word because we love long church words, but
and our own words, right? Words that no one else uses. No one is saying apostolate other than Catholics.
Right. We love it. That's how you know it's Catholic. If
Exactly.
no one, So so for me, I really think the core conviction to me is that we're entering into this new apostolic age, where it's a new apostolic moment for the church. In a lot of ways, the Christendom moment, you know, especially in the culture that we're living in, is coming to an end. And so, in a lot of ways, I think there's been some great movements and different ecclesial communities and things that have really been about this call to the new evangelization. So that's how I interpret John Paul's call to the new evangelization, is just how does the church exist and act in this moment of cultural change. And to me, there began to burn in me. I studied theology and all this stuff, and there began to burn in me the sense that if this was really going to happen, though, this new apostolic age was going to become normative Catholicism instead of just extraordinary Catholicism happening somewhere else, that it had to exist in the parish. And so I worked at a couple different parishes in kind of director of evangelization roles, and then started L'Alto while I was still working in a parish, just as a way to say, you know, as I was seeing more pastors and parishes wrestling with these questions of like, how do we do this culture change thing? Just wanting to be a resource and a support for them in that. And now it's my full-time work, which has brought us back out to Denver now since, you know, I've been full-time running L'Alto since December 2017.
So Tim, talk a little bit about that distinction you make between a Christendom time and an apostolic age. Because I think lots of us, you know, you talk about the family you were raised in, and I know lots of us here raised in really strong families, but others kind of came to the church in a different way. Can you explain the difference between a Christendom age and an apostolic age? Yeah,
so, you know, the early church, right, is the original kind of apostolic moment where the overall culture is generally not supportive of Christian belief and practice, right? Like you could say that the Colosseum is a good example of that, right?
So, you mean when they're making Christians fight lions?
Yeah.
That's not a strong Christian culture.
Not supportive,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you for that illustration.
A little dark humor for you, yeah. So, you know, so in that moment, the church is really this what the soul is to the body, the church is to the world. Then, called to kind of go outward, and then this cultural moment kind of developed which we call Christendom, which is where the overall culture picked up a lot of the attitudes and beliefs, and even a lot of the things that our culture believes in, like human dignity, are Christian concepts that really were adopted then by the overall culture as like, this is a good thing that we should all, kind of ascribe to.
Right, because you look at some of the kind of Roman practices where if they had a child they didn't want, they would just expose that child, put the child out in the woods, right? And say, like, we don't want this child. Or there would be lots of removal of people who are sick or maybe handicapped in some way, like extricate them from society instead of acknowledging the human dignity that every individual has.
And so, there's this epistle to Diognetus, which is one of these like early church documents, and it talks about this is what distinguishes the Christians, is this remarkable way of life that's so countercultural, and it's different, and it compelled people to say, what's going on here? So then it becomes more like baked into the culture, where I would say, almost think of it in terms of like pressures. Are the pressures pushing inward toward the church and toward maybe more generally just, Christian religion, or are the cultural pressures pushing away from it? And so there's always been sin and there's always been brokenness, but what distinguishes like a cultural moment or the fundamental attitude of the church is how it stands in relation to the overall culture. So we kind of, there's nothing like necessarily wrong with Christendom. It's kind of a good thing in a lot of ways that it supports, Catholic life and practice, but it's just not the cultural moment we're in anymore. I think some sociologists have noted that, millennials, the much maligned millennial generation, right, with our expensive coffees and avocado toast, are the first. We're the first post-Christian, like we were raised in a post-Christian culture, and that's one of the reasons you're seeing some of the statistics you are with millennials is there's really nothing keeping them in the church actively. So unless we radically propose the gospel to each individual, we can't presuppose it anymore in terms of practice.
Yeah, all the support of the culture, society, neighborhoods, even schools, a lot of that has been washed away. And now if someone's going to choose to be a disciple of Christ, they have to be, as Sherry Waddell says, intentional disciples, right? They have to be really intentional about choosing to follow Christ. It's not just going to be something where they've inherited from their parents and they can kind of go along and be swept up in the Christian culture that helps them live a virtuous life.
So one thing that's interesting about, I guess maybe people who would be listening today is I would think that many who are listening, they're not maybe in positions of leadership. Like, so what would you say to, a Catholic who let's say average plus, right? Goes to Mass on Sunday. What would you say to them who's like maybe in a situation, maybe some of their family's fallen away, maybe their parish isn't super dynamic?
Maybe someone who's come to the Parish Day of Renewal?
Maybe.
Is that what you're talking about? Those individuals?
So people are raising their hands in the audience. Like, what do we do? I think that's the right question, because I think sometimes, like, I operate in the professional church world, right? I work with a lot of people who are in professional ministry and stuff, and I think one of the...
As you point to the priest?
Do you do this professionally? Okay.
Is this like your job?
Yeah.
So there can be almost this sense, I think, when we hear words like parish renewal or whatever, where it's like, oh, good, someone else is taking care of the problem.
Right.
But I think the difference between just parish renewal, where we're trying to do parish life slightly better, or parish renewal in what the Unleash the Gospel letter talks about is this like cultural moment we exist in, is a totally different prospect where I really see, I mean, even the church has been prophetically calling this for this a long time. Like the priest's job is to sanctify the lay faithful, and then the lay faithful's job is to go out and sanctify the entire world. Like whatever moment there was for the laity to be passive observers, even in a renewal process, that's not what we're looking at anymore. So I would say it's not even so much the question wouldn't even be what can the laity do, but it's like, can we afford for them to not do anything? That's the only way renewal is going to happen, is if we, the laity, take seriously the call to holiness, to community, and to mission. Like, unless we grab hold of those three principles and figure out dynamically and creatively how to bake them into our lived experience as disciples, like our church, it doesn't matter what we in the professional church world do. Like that's the end goal of everything.
Right.
And that's the genius of the Second Vatican Council, is this call to holiness that everyone has, right? Not just those with collars or those that wear habits, but everyone has this call to holiness. And so, historically it talks about the time it takes for a council to be like really lived is a half century to a century for a council to take root in the life of a church. And I think we're still figuring out how to live what the Second Vatican Council calls us to. There's a beauty in the role that the laity play during the Mass and actively at the parish. But the real call for the laity is to take the gospel and to bring it into their families, their workplaces, their neighborhoods, to bring the beauty of the faith out into the world rather than just saying, how can I do more things at the church? It's how can I be equipped to then be the leaven of the gospel that God wants me to be, the salt of the earth and the light of the world.
Yeah, I would add, I think it's almost like we want practicals and we need them, but I think almost like the point we're at as a church right now is we're in this transition moment from Christendom into a more apostolic age again, is I'd almost like to just hold out for people the kind of the timeless principles that we should be striving for and almost invite people to creatively and dynamically figure out how to do that. That's what I would almost say is I don't want to so much say, we can talk about, you can grow communities in your houses and pray together and all those different things. I think that's kind of some of what it looks like is us starting to gather and pray and be on mission and invite other people into our lives. But I think more than anything, that's what I've really come to start enjoying doing is just saying, this is what it has to have. It has to have holiness. It has to have a real prayer, a depth of prayer with the Lord. It has to have authentic and vulnerable community. And it has to have a radical orientation toward mission. And what that looks like, I'd almost love to say, well, you were baptized. So ask the Holy Spirit. Do you know?
Yeah, and that's and in some ways that's scarier, but it's more beautiful too.
Yeah.
Because you're like, well, what's God gonna say?
Well, yeah, and that's the diversity that Sister Miriam has talked about these past couple of days at our Parish Day of Renewal. Is you are the only. You are the unique flower that God has planted in his garden, and you have a mission that no one else can do, right? So what God has asked you to do is going to look completely different than what he's asked me to do, your neighbor, your spouse, your friends. That God has a specific mission for you. And so he's going to ask you to do something unique that no one else can do.
Tim, I know that you're writing these things. And sometimes it's hard to go through all of this information and read numbers and what marriage rates are and what they used to be and all that stuff. What is inspiring you though still? What's giving you hope? What are you looking at and you're like, oh, but there's still good in this?
Yeah, I think for sure, even in some senses, I do think it's important for us to note the cultural, some of the discouraging trends, almost to just speak to what people experience anyway.
Sure.
Because we look around and we're we feel that, we sense it as we go, and but in reality, it's been amazing. There's so much good stuff already happening. There's so many pockets of renewal. I do get to travel a fair amount, and I see pockets of renewal everywhere. This group here is a group that's gathered together, wrestling with these questions together. There are similar groups wrestling with these questions all over the country, and I see a core solidifying that really wants to be part of the solution. And it's not just happening in one corner of the world. It really is happening everywhere. So it's still maybe in bud form or in seed form. In other places, it's more mature. I think, Southeast Michigan was some of the great things. I was just talking to somebody about some of the stuff that was happening at the seminary in 2006 that was kind of along these lines. And it's there has been, I think a particular anointing, not to just flatter you all, but a particular anointing.
Go ahead. You can bring on the flattery.
In a particular way on Father Stephen Pullis and his leadership.
Thank you.
God is, I think this area and this diocese, archdiocese in particular, are God is using as an example. I think the election of Archbishop Vigneron as the vice president of the USCCB is an example of that. His brother bishops have noticed that in many ways this archdiocese is leading a charge to show other places around the world what it could look like. And to me, that's an example that people are noticing around the country. So there is a lot of hope. This is giving the reason this book exists is because there's a hunger for people asking, well, how? This book isn't the first book coming out there saying hey, there's a problem.
Right.
What this is about is here's, as people are starting to wrestle towards solutions, here are some things you can do. And so the fact that there's even a hunger for this shows how far along in the conversation we've already come in the last 10 years or so.
So Tim, your book is called Made for Mission, Renewing Your Parish Culture, and it just came out in September, was it?
It was actually a little later than that, so it just released. It's a long story with different book publishers and all this stuff, but it's
really
recent.
New,
it's brand spanking new. Yeah.
And there's
Put your
something
hands
else
together.
Yeah.
Hey.
So we just have a couple of minutes left. I want to ask you about this project called Revive that you're working on, that
Yes.
you're one of the co-founders of.
Yes.
That's a parish initiative to help change parish culture as well, too, right?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, my personal story, I think we'd all tell the story a little different, but my personal story with Revive is I've spent the last few years working with parishes all around the country who are attempting this question of renewal, and they want to understand what to do differently. And as I've worked with them and engaged with them, I've realized that there is a call for creativity and new skills and solutions in every area of parish life. The way that we do everything from stewardship and fundraising to discipleship and evangelization to women's ministry and youth ministry, and it's an all full scale effort to really bring renewal in all those areas. And a lot of pastors are really asking the question of, well, how do we get trained on this?
Right.
How do we? And especially an average parish might have maybe 15 staff people, and then they've got 100 catechists, and they've got 200 greeters, and there's all these different leaders that need to be mobilized for mission. How do we form them? How do we train them? Events like this are great. And then what our platform does is we went out to all the experts in each of those areas, and we said, could you teach like a 3-hour deep dive course into this critical skill area so that, really personally coaching parishes through it? So Mark Hart teaching youth ministry, and Chris Stefanik teaching evangelization, and Julianne Stans, who's a consultant to USCCB, teaching discipleship. And
Father Mike Schmitz. I've been watching the Father Mike Schmitz one on preaching, and it's awesome. It's a great resource, very practical, but also deep roots about what the goal of preaching is meant to be as a priest or as a deacon.
Yeah, and so that the goal was to make it as accessible and easy for parishes to use as possible to train all of their leaders in all those areas. So it's an online platform, video-based courses with different downloadable resources to kind of guide you through. And they're beautifully shot. It's a really exciting project to have been a part of that I think is going to be something that can kind of help every parish, no matter where they're at, take the next steps forward. Because I really do think parish renewal depends on renewed leaders. Like, there is no parish renewal without the renewal of leaders, and so that's what this platform is really aimed at doing. So it's exciting.
That's awesome.
That's great. Tim, all of our guests, before we wrap up, we always ask them if they have a final word they want to share with our listeners, our live audience here, and all those who are going to listen through the podcast platform. Any final word you want to share?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think one of the things that I've been really convicted about and sharing recently, because especially with the book, having different conversations with people and stuff, is all of these questions. The very first thing, like Sister Miriam was kind of talking about today, the very first thing in all of this is letting the Lord love you. God's love is transformative. It's powerful. It's personal. It's intimate. And like the fire of God's love is what creates. Mother Teresa wasn't just a slightly more well-behaved person. She was somebody who was radically renewed in the grace of Jesus Christ, and her witness to the world was undeniable. Like, you can't look at that and say anything except something different has happened here. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. I look at Mother Teresa and I think God must have risen from the dead, I guess. So I think in a lot of ways that's where it begins for all of us, is in that personal renewal project.
Amen.
Thanks
Thank
be
you
to
so
God.
much, and thanks to our audience for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Before we say goodbye, if you liked this episode, please share it with your friends, your neighbors, your relatives, your Trader Joe cashier. You can also leave us a review on iTunes. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Our handle is @OpenDoorDetroit. Help us unleash the gospel. Open Door Policy was produced by Ron Pangborn and the creative team of the Archdiocese of Detroit.
We love long church words.
Words that no one else uses.
I'm Father Steve Poulos with Danielle Center.
And this has been another episode of Open Door Policy.